Suburbs are supposed to be safe. That's the entire pitch. Trade the city for a quiet street, a two-car garage, a lawn, a fence, neighbors who wave at you every morning. It's the version of safety that gets sold in real estate listings and moving day photos. But some of the most disturbing true crimes in American history didn't happen in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. They happened behind white picket fences, inside split-level houses with manicured lawns, in neighborhoods where everyone insisted afterward that nothing like that could ever happen there. Tonight, 3 true stories. A devout church-going family man who calmly murdered his entire household and then simply vanished into an ordinary new life for 18 years. A friendly neighbor, a church council president, a Cub Scout leader who was secretly one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, and a quiet Long Island street that became the site of one of the most infamous mass murders in the country. A house so notorious it's still famous today, 50 years later. Every detail in this video is documented fact. Let's get into it. Story 1. The man who vanished Westfield, New Jersey, is the kind of town people move to specifically to raise a family. Tree-lined streets, good schools, church on Sundays. In 1965, an accountant named John List moved his wife, his 3 children, and his elderly mother into a 19-room Victorian mansion on Hillside Avenue, complete with a ballroom, marble fireplaces, and a stained glass skylight rumored to be a genuine Tiffany original. To everyone who knew them, the Lists were the picture of suburban success. List himself seemed almost aggressively respectable. He was a strict Lutheran, a Sunday school teacher, and by every outward account, a devoted family man who insisted his children follow rigid, disciplined rules. Neighbors described him as reserved but perfectly ordinary. The kind of man you trust with your own kids without a second thought. What none of them knew was that List's life was quietly falling apart. He lost his job at a Jersey City bank, and rather than tell his wife and mother, he kept up the charade every single day, putting on his suit, leaving the house at the same time each morning, and spending his hours at the train station reading newspapers or sitting through job interviews that went nowhere. He secretly diverted money from his elderly mother's bank account just to keep the mortgage paid. His wife was struggling with alcoholism and a serious undisclosed illness, and List, consumed by his failing finances and his fear that his family was drifting away from their faith, made a decision that would define the rest of his life and end theirs. On the morning of November 9th, 1971, List sent his children off to school as he did every day. Once the house was empty of witnesses, he took 2 handguns, his own 9mm pistol and his father's old revolver, and shot his wife, Helen, in the back of the head as she sat in the kitchen. He carried her body into the mansion's ballroom. He then went upstairs to the 3rd floor, where his 84-year-old mother lived, and shot her as well. He was unable to carry her down the stairs, so he simply left her body where it fell. Then he waited. One by one, as his children came home from school that afternoon, List killed each of them the same way. His 16-year-old daughter Patricia, his 13-year-old son Frederick. He laid their bodies out neatly in the ballroom next to their mothers. His oldest son, John Jr., came home last after List had actually gone out to watch him play in a soccer game earlier that same day. sitting in the stands, cheering, with 3 family members already dead in his house. When List attempted to shoot his oldest son back at the house, the gun misfired, and the 2 struggled before List finally killed him too, shooting him repeatedly. With his entire family dead, List cleaned the blood from the kitchen floor, sat down, and wrote a 5-page letter to his pastor, calmly explaining that he had killed his family to save their souls, believing they would go to heaven before poverty and shame could tear them apart or pull them from their faith. He left the letter at the scene, right next to the bodies. Then he did something almost incomprehensible in its coldness. He cancelled the mail, the milk delivery, and the newspaper subscription. He wrote to the children's school saying the family would be away visiting a sick relative. He turned the intercom system on to play organ music through the empty house day and night. And then he simply walked out the front door, drove to John F. Kennedy Airport, abandoned the family car in the parking lot, and disappeared. For nearly a month, nobody suspected a thing. The lights stayed on. The organ music kept playing behind the curtained windows. It wasn't until early December, when neighbors finally grew concerned about the constantly lit, seemingly empty house, that police were called in. When they entered, they found List's 5-page confession sitting beside the bodies of his mother, his wife, and his 3 children, laid out in the ballroom as if in some kind of formal arrangement. John List was gone. Genuinely gone. He had planned his escape with the same cold precision he'd used to plan the murders, and for the next 18 years, he simply vanished. He resurfaced under a new name, Robert Clark, in Colorado and later Virginia, where he remarried, rejoined a Lutheran congregation, and returned to work as an accountant, living quietly for nearly 2 decades as if nothing had ever happened. Investigators, meanwhile, hit dead end after dead end. The case went cold. It was finally cracked in 1989 when the television show America's Most Wanted profiled the case and aired a forensic artist's specially aged bust of what List might look like nearly 2 decades later. A neighbor in Virginia recognized the likeness almost immediately and called it in. Police arrested List, now going by Bob Clark, in June of that year. He was extradited to New Jersey, convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder, and sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms. What makes this story so unsettling isn't just the murders themselves, it's the 18 years in between. An ordinary man, going to church, going to work, mowing his lawn, living an entirely unremarkable second life 2 states away, while his family lay dead in a mansion he'd meticulously arranged like a crime scene from a play. Neighbors in Westfield still talk about the house today. Children reportedly still won't walk past the property, even though the original mansion burned down in an unsolved fire less than a year after the murders, and a completely new house was built on the same lot in 1974. The land remembers, even if the walls don't. Story 2. The neighbor no one suspected. If there's one story that proves the person living next door can be a complete stranger, it's this one. Dennis Rader grew up in Wichita, Kansas, in what looked from the outside like a completely normal Midwestern childhood. Fishing trips, comic books, Boy Scouts. What nobody around him knew was that he was also quietly torturing and killing small animals and developing violent sexual fantasies involving bondage that would define the rest of his life. He served in the Air Force, came home, got married, had 2 children, and eventually took a job installing home security alarm systems. A detail that in hindsight is almost too disturbing to be believable. The man teaching Wichita families how to protect themselves from intruders was quietly becoming one of the city's most dangerous residents. Starting in January of 1974, Rader broke into the home of the Otero family and murdered 4 of them: the father, mother, and 2 of their children, in a methodical, torturous killing that would define his signature style for decades. Months later, he wrote a letter to a local newspaper, hidden inside a library book, confessing to the murders and coining the name he wanted to be known by: BTK, bind, torture, kill. Over the next several years, Rader kept killing and kept taunting police and the media with letters, packages, and phone calls describing his crimes in graphic, deliberate detail. He strangled a mother named Shirley Vian after barricading her 3 young children in a bathroom so they wouldn't witness what he was about to do. He broke into the home of 25-year-old Nancy Fox, strangled her, and then calmly used a payphone afterward to call the police and report his own crime. He once gained entry into a woman's home by impersonating a telephone repairman, then strangled her while her 2-year-old child was in the house. In total, he's known to have killed at least 10 people between 1974 and 1991, methodically binding, torturing, and killing his victims, almost always inside their own homes. And through every single one of those years, Rader was living an entirely ordinary suburban life just outside Wichita. He was married. He had 2 kids. He served as president of the church council at Christ Lutheran Church. He was a Cub Scout leader. Neighbors described him, without exception, as helpful, trustworthy, and kind. The kind of man you'd ask to watch your house while you were on vacation. In one detail that still unsettles investigators who work the case, Rader specifically targeted and killed a neighbor who lived just a couple of doors down from his own home, later admitting he did it simply to see if he could get away with it, living within sight of the crime scene for years afterward. After 1991, the murders simply stopped and the case went cold for over a decade. Investigators genuinely believed BTK might be dead, imprisoned for an unrelated crime, or otherwise incapacitated. The standard assumptions made about serial killers who suddenly go silent. They were wrong. Rader hadn't stopped because he was gone. He'd simply stopped killing while continuing to live his normal suburban life, raising his children, attending church, working as a compliance officer for his local city government. Then, in 2004, on the 30th anniversary of his first murders, a local newspaper ran a story asking whether the BTK case would ever be solved. Rader read it, and by his own later admission to investigators, simply because he was bored, decided to resurface. He began sending new letters and packages to media outlets, taunting police all over again, seemingly unable to resist the temptation of renewed attention. It was, in the end, exactly that resurfacing that led to his downfall. In one exchange with investigators, Rader asked, through a coded message, whether a computer floppy disk could be traced back to him if he used it to send information. Police, through a classified newspaper ad, assured him it couldn't. He sent the disk. It was traced almost immediately, directly back to the church where he served as council president. DNA evidence sealed the case. Rader was arrested driving near his own home on February 25, 2005. When police pulled him over and told him he was going to be arrested, Rader reportedly replied that he had suspicions why. He pleaded guilty to 10 counts of murder later that year and was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms. What makes this story stick with people, more than the murders themselves, is what it means for the idea of knowing your neighbors. The people of Wichita had spent decades being warned about a killer among them, taken precautions, locking their doors, staying alert, never realizing the man selling them home security systems, teaching the children in Scouts, and leading their church congregation was the very thing they were afraid of. Story 3. The house on Ocean Avenue, Amityville, New York, is a small, quiet town on the south shore of Long Island. Exactly the kind of place people picture when they imagine an idyllic American suburb. In the early 1970s, the DeFeo family moved into a large Dutch colonial house at 112 Ocean Avenue, complete with a statue of the Virgin Mary in the front yard and a small sign near a door that read "High Hopes." To their neighbors, the DeFeos seemed like a nice, normal Catholic family. They held Sunday prayer huddles, the father gave neighbors rides when they needed them, and the family looked out for a widow who lived nearby after her husband passed away. Behind closed doors, it was a very different story. Ronald DeFeo Sr. was strict and controlling, and his eldest son, 23-year-old Ronald Jr., known to everyone as Butch, had a long, well-documented history of heavy drinking, drug use, and violent outbursts. He'd gotten into fights around town. He'd once attempted to attack his own father with a shotgun during an argument between his parents. Friends described him as someone who could seem perfectly normal one day and dangerously volatile the next. On the night of November 13, 1974, sometime in the early morning hours, Butch DeFeo took a .35 caliber Marlin rifle and shot his father as he slept in bed. Then he shot his mother. Then one by one, he went into the bedrooms of his 4 younger siblings: 18-year-old Dawn, 13-year-old Allison, 12-year-old Mark, and 9-year-old John Matthew, and shot each of them as well while they slept. What makes the crime scene itself so unsettling, even to investigators who worked it, is that every single victim was found in nearly the exact same position, tucked in bed, seemingly still asleep. None of them showed any sign of having woken up or struggled. The medical examiner found no evidence that any of them had been drugged. And despite multiple rifle shots being fired inside a quiet residential house on a quiet residential street, not a single neighbor reported hearing any gunfire that night. After the killings, DeFeo took a shower, changed his clothes, and calmly disposed of the evidence: the rifle, his blood-stained clothing, before going to work as usual the next morning, as though nothing at all had happened. That evening, he showed up at a nearby bar and announced to the people inside that he believed his parents had just been shot. A group of patrons went back to the house with him and discovered the full scope of what had happened. All 6 family members dead in their beds. DeFeo's first story was that a mob hitman had done it, and he even named a specific suspect. But the story fell apart almost immediately once police discovered the alleged hitman had a solid alibi out of state. By the very next day, DeFeo confessed to killing his entire family himself, later telling detectives, in his own words, that once he'd started, he simply couldn't stop. He also claimed, at various points, that he had heard voices coming from inside the house that pushed him to do it. He was convicted on 6 counts of murder in 1975 and sentenced to 6 consecutive terms of 25 years to life. He died in prison in March of 2021, having spent nearly 47 years behind bars without ever offering a fully consistent explanation for what happened that night. What turned this already horrifying true crime into a permanent piece of pop culture is what happened next. Just over a year after the murders, a new family, George and Kathy Lutz, along with their 3 children, moved into 112 Ocean Avenue. They lasted only 28 days before fleeing the house, later claiming they'd experienced terrifying paranormal phenomena inside. Strange voices, unexplained cold spots, doors that moved on their own. Their account became the basis for the 1977 book, The Amityville Horror, and the blockbuster 1979 film that followed, which turned the house into one of the most famous haunted houses in American pop culture. Many journalists, skeptics, and even lifelong Amityville residents have since disputed the Lutz family's haunting claims as an elaborate hoax, dreamed up to capitalize on the notoriety of the murders. But whether or not anything paranormal ever happened inside that house, the underlying tragedy was never in question. 6 real people, a real family, shot to death in their beds on a quiet suburban street by one of their own. The house still stands today, though it's changed hands several times, and its distinctive quarter-circle attic windows, the ones that always seem to stare out at the street like a pair of eyes, have since been remodeled specifically so true crime tourists have a harder time finding it. 3 stories, 3 quiet, ordinary suburban streets. A father everyone trusted who vanished into an entirely new life after murdering his own family. A neighbor everyone loved who spent 30 years secretly terrorizing the very community that adored him. And a house that became a permanent symbol of horror, built on top of a real tragedy that gets a little lost every time someone brings up ghosts instead. What ties all 3 of these stories together is the same unsettling truth. Every single warning sign was hiding in plain sight. In a church pew, in a scout meeting, behind a nice, normal family front yard sign. The suburbs sell you the promise of safety precisely because everyone looks the same, follows the same routines, waves at you from the same driveways. These 3 stories are proof that the promise doesn't always hold. The next time you look at a quiet street lined with identical houses and manicured lawns, remember, you never really know what's happening behind any one of those doors. If this video got under your skin, hit subscribe. New true horror stories every week. And let me know in the comments which one of these 3 stories disturbed you the most. See you in the next one.